Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started, you guys. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm Clarin Collins from the Office of Scholarship and Innovation, and we are here today to talk about working with and conducting research with school partners. And first, we're going to have Deborah Murphy from OCED speak to us about IRB for education-specific research. And then later, we will have a couple of our faculty, as well as Sarah Pulaski from the Office of Research Advancement, speak to considerations specifically with schools and perhaps IRB considerations at the school level. So welcome, and we'll get started with Deb, and there will be time for questions too at the end of her presentation. Thank you.
So I have lots of slides here today, and I'm going to skip over some of them, but I wanted them to be available to you just in case you need them for the future. First, I just want to talk a little bit about research integrity at ASU, and I want to give you a feeling about how we believe support should be provided to the faculty. We're part of research operations that reports to Ponch. And any of you who have heard Ponch speak know how important service to the faculty is to him, but we have a long-standing commitment here of service to the faculty. So as I talk about this, I want you to keep in mind that our first customer is complying with regulations and protecting participants, but very close to that, we hold support to the faculty. So our purpose, the mission of our group is to ensure university compliance with state, local, and federal regulations through the ethical and responsible conduct of research. We talked just very briefly about why compliance matters so much. Our objective is to review the culture here and identify resources that will help you do a better job in your research program. So I'm still hoping that one of these days I can learn to juggle. My son does it very well. I end up hitting somebody on the head with an orange. But so I always see our job here as a little bit of a juggling act. We need to protect participants. We need to demonstrate our culture of compliance and follow the regulations. But if you can't support researchers, you're why we're here. So if we can't support our students and our researchers, that, you know, it doesn't really matter how strong our program is if we have no customers. So other reasons why compliance matters so much is the potential loss of funding, the financial risk of fines and penalties, the risks, particularly in our discussion today, to humans and the environment in which they live, a reputational risk to the investigators, and a loss of public trust. So this is my circle of trust and accountability, and each of us, in addition to thinking about what it means for our research or how it impacts the university, we need to think about how our actions and what we do in our everyday work life affect society and the public and the media and the trust that they have in us as we spend public funds. So this is all the rules we have around research. There's many of them. So we have roles here. We have the investigators, and that's why we're here, teachers and investigators who are teaching our new students coming in, demonstrating their ethical commitments. We have research administrators like me, the paper people, compliance officials for our various compliance committees, and then we have campus officials such as your deans, the unit directors, our president, the provost, and the vice presidents. So now we're going to talk about the good stuff. So as I talk today, I'm mainly talking about the regulations as they are today. There are some changes proposed to take effect on January 18th, but we have heard that there will be a delay in implementing those changes. So I'm not talking about them because we don't know really when they're going to happen. So these are all the areas we provide support in. Today we're talking about human subjects. And I call this my roadshow. I said this once at a presentation that I had the best job at the university, and Dr. Crow was there. So I no longer say that. I have the best job for me at the university. So I've talked a little bit about the changes that are coming. The biggest changes that will come are a few changes to exemption categories, which is being clearer about oral history and its exemption, providing greater flexibility for researchers in areas such as journalism. They're going to need, hopefully eliminate the need for an annual review for studies that pose minimal risk. And they're going to mandate the use of a single IRB for cooperative research. All these things are good, and I'm very excited for them to come. Talk a little bit about definitions, very brief historical perspective, not much on the regulations. Mostly I want to talk about human subjects research at ASU. So as I get to these things, I want 2 people to volunteer to tell me their burning question now so that I can kind of tailor what I'm going to talk about to that. So I hope that 2 of you have a question for me. Yes.
So, for example, I had a research that I conducted at a different university, and I had an IRB approval at that university, but that expired. But I'm hoping to continue using the other data that I haven't used to work on some publications for the next coming years. And I was wondering, for ASU, how would I navigate that? Do I reapply again for the data that I've already had approved in a previous institution? And so
Yeah, I'll talk about that. That's pretty
great.
streamlined here.
Okay.
One other question? Anybody else have another question? Yes.
So I'm going to be doing some research on professional development, hopefully looking at some classroom observations. So the level of work that I would need to do with the teachers and or the students, if the students aren't going to be videotaped or recorded, if it's just going to be observing the teacher, do I still have to have something, provisions there for the students? So issues along that line.
In public classrooms?
Yes.
Grade school or K-12?
K-12, yes.
Okay. I'll talk about both those things. What is the IRB and what do you need to know? So the IRB is an institutional review board. It's a committee of your peers. It is the university policy and state and federal law that all human subjects research must be reviewed and approved before the research begins. So you can't go out and recruit first and then come in. But that's different than using data that was previously collected. So we'll talk about that. So long in the past, the government had a heavy hand and they closed many institutions down for not complying with the rules. And most of the closures didn't really have to do with risk to humans, except for the one at Johns Hopkins. Most of it had to do with the lack of the IRB's ability to take care of the paperwork. So when I took over as the director of the compliance group in 2004, I had a hot mess. We had 1 graduate student and 1 staff member doing all the areas of compliance, and we had paper files that weren't logged anywhere. And I had IRB coordinators just flipping out thinking, oh my God, we're gonna get shut down. So I called OHRP up on the phone and I said, I have about 2,500 open studies and I have no idea when they were approved. Would you like to come visit? So they said no, but we'd like a report when you get down. So, but the story about that is to just ask for help when you get it. Usually the government will be more, they didn't want to come look at 2,500 stacks of paper. The history of IRB is still continuing to grow. So there's a couple of really good case studies that you can share in your classroom with your students about why we have human subjects protections and why the regulations are so rigid. The most interesting of these on my list here is the Tuskegee syphilis study, which I think it's amazing because it went on from 1932 and it wasn't exposed until 1972. 40 years is a long time. And then the Milgram study is another easy case study for students to understand. So I encourage you to use those 2 or any others in your classroom to help your students understand why the regulations are important. My favorite part of all the rules we follow is the Nuremberg Code, and I call that my ruler. And so if every investigator planning their research studies looks at these questions and answers them in their study design, whether or not they have IRB approval, I think you'll get good, solid data from your human subjects. You need voluntary consent. You need to anticipate your scientific benefits and be able to justify them. You must ensure that your benefits outweigh the risks. If it's appropriate, you would do animal research first. You would never want to do your testing first in humans. It's our responsibility to avoid suffering. We can't intend death or disability. It's just like being a physician. We want to do no harm. Your subjects should be able to withdraw at any time. And in school-based research, I know that's a problem because we have subject pools And we need to get a certain amount of data in our pool to get an outcome, but you still have to allow for them to withdraw. The investigators must be qualified by experience and training, and so here at ASU, only staff and faculty members can be principal investigators, and they must be responsible for any of their students' research, and that you will voluntarily stop any research if harm occurs. Yes? Hi.
Postdoc in the room. So how does a postdoc go through the process? Can they be a PI?
If the unit director calls them an employee, we can add them to the database. Postdocs are kind of like, I think they're employees. You get a paycheck and benefits, we can find you and hold you accountable. So that's the primary responsibility there. So we have had several audits here. We came out okay. The big black mark on our IRB is a have-a-supine lawsuit from about 2005. It's a great learning opportunity. There's many times in history where government-to-government relations have not been very good, but I think so long as you look at it that way, that the Navajo Nation is a government just like the country of France, we have to follow the rules that they set, and they get the deciding vote. This is just some other studies that have a reason why we need to have the regulations. And I'm not going to go through these examples today, but you'll post the slides and you can get the links of any of them that you want. So I wish in the old regulations and the new regulations, and I asked it for Christmas last year before the new changes came out. I'm Catholic, I didn't get it under the Christmas tree from either the saints or from Santa Claus. I wanted the definitions to be like the Webster Dictionary. Exempt should mean you don't have to come see us, but that's not the way it is. So I will review the definitions for you. They aren't changing much in the new ones. So research is a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. And so the words generalizable knowledge are subjective. And so we see a lot of studies and pilot studies that I'm not a scientist. In my opinion, they wouldn't be able to be generalized, but the investigator makes that call. Human subjects must be a living individual about whom an investigator obtains data through intervention or interaction with the individual or private information about the individual. So if it's information on deceased individuals, there may be other rules you have to follow to get that information, but it's not an IRB question. To my mind, systematic investigations include a pilot study if the PI thinks they will use the data to generate knowledge to move forward. It excludes quality control, teaching, marketing polls, things like that. Human subjects research may exclude de-identified secondary data sets so long as the investigator will never have access to the code and there's an agreement between the investigator and the provider that the key will never be released. And the investigator is responsible for holding those records. The basic principles of the Belmont Report are respect for persons. You need to tell subjects who, what, why, and get their consent. You need to minimize the harms and risks to demonstrate beneficence. And justice means that you're spreading the risk and benefit. So if you're having all women or all of one nationality, you need to have a really good explanation about why you're excluding this group or that group. And this is just an application that shows how you demonstrate the principles of the Belmont. Respect for persons is demonstrated in the informed consent form. Beneficence is your assessment of the risks and benefits, and justice demonstrates your fair subject selection. And here at ASU and at most institutions, we require that the individual investigator not be the one to decide whether IRB approval is required. So we ask that you submit an application and we'll let you know whether it's required or not. We are working with some collaborating institutions to develop a wizard an IRB wizard that would allow an investigator to answer 5 or 10 simple questions and get a determination about whether you're exempt. So if you got that, we hope to launch that next spring. When we launch that, if you got an exemption notification from the wizard, you could just put that with your records, and the IRB will audit a certain number of them to make sure that investigators are understanding the process. So that will streamline the process even further, I think. The IRB is here to assist you. Our success is measured by the degree to which researchers' habits are driven by ethical principles not meeting the regulations. So mistakes can happen. We're all people. So I always would rather hear somebody say, oops, I've gone forward with my recruitment a little too soon. Can you help me out? So if you have a problem or your students have a problem, come to us early so that we can make it right for you. We probably all have a good feeling for informed consent. We need to make sure that decision making is competent. We have requirements for consent and assent. Really, I want you to think about the informed consent as a process. I know in general we have a form, sometimes it's a verbal consent, but informed consent is ensuring that the individuals that you're recruiting that are going to participate with you, when they leave the room and get home, they should be able to tell their neighbor or their daughter, I'm participating in a study from research and I'll be required to do this. So just a good understanding of what your expectations are. We ask that consent forms be comprehensible at the 6th grade reading level. That's almost impossible to do. So just important to make sure that your requirements are clear and that you're not using a lot of technical jargon. Okay, we can skip that one. The elements of consent are pretty clear. You tell them the purpose, how long it will take, what they will have to do, if there are any risks, who they can contact if they have questions. Remind them that it's voluntary, doesn't have to be signed. It can be answering the questions on this survey or considered your consent to participate. So lots of different ways you can document the consent process. 3 types of review, and then I'm going to see how we go. So exempt, it's the least, all of our applications are online. So you submit it online, the reviewer is a staff person, they review it online. They ask you some cleanup questions just to make sure that everything's consistent. Then it'll go to a staff reviewer if it's exempt. We require that you have taken the city online courses. If it's expedited, that means that a voting member of the IRB looks at your study. So it's more of a peer review process from a member of the board. And full board means that there's more than minimal risks and that review will happen at a convened meeting of the members. Exempt research is most survey with anonymous with adults, anonymously recorded or no risk. Research on educational practices, such as what you're considering doing in the classroom. Existing data or records that cannot be tied to participants, which may be what you're doing. And these types of research projects that are exempt do not usually require a signed consent form. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the educational practices piece. So there's a couple of ways that we can do research in the classroom. So if you're going to interact with the children, if you're going to have surveys for them or measure their performance by looking at their grades, then we require either a parental permission with a child assent, or we require that if it's part of the educational program of the school, that the principal or the district administrator approve for the parents. If you're only going to be videotaping the parents, the principal should be able to give you a release from consent of only the teachers. So they should give you should be able to get their permission, and maybe they want the children's parents to be notified, but I've seen it very common where the principal will just waive it. You're welcome. So when you fill out the application, you're going to fill out a social behavioral application and just be really clear in their description that you're not going to be interacting or videotaping the children. back up just a minute and I'll talk about the one about existing data or records. So your study was approved by another IRB, and was it approved in exempt category or expedited? Exempt. Okay, so in theory you could proceed with just that approval, but I don't know how long other IRBs keep their records. And exempt approvals here go really fast. You should get an answer in less than a week. So I recommend that you apply just for an exempt approval to use previously collected data. And just be clear that you collected it previously, where you collected it, and provide them maybe a copy of your approval letter. It should go really quick. Okay, next. Training. So training is required of all individuals who are listed as study team members. So if you're engaged in the research project, the principal investigator, any co-investigators, any individuals that will work with recruitment, consent, or analyzing data have to take the training. It's good for 4 years. At the end of 4 years, you take a refresher, which is much less time consuming. We're currently now evaluating the modules in City that we use, because it does take quite a bit of time and there's a lot of information in there that may or may not apply. So we're trying to see which modules we can move out as optional. So if you take the training and you have an opinion about that, I'd really like to hear it. You can send that to me by email. Expedited review is really research that's minimal risk. That would mean risk that's equivalent to what you encounter in your everyday life. So the everyday life of your participants, not the everyday life of Deb Murphy. Full board are examples of that are studies with children that have manipulations, anything that would have DEXA in it, greater than moderate exercise or a vulnerable population, if there's deception beyond brief deception, treatment studies where you have arms and trials, some survey studies depending on the topic. So bullying is example, but we see a lot of student-initiated research, so I tell them no sex, no drugs, and no rock and roll. Those kind of studies are meant for professors. Studies for students shouldn't involve vulnerable activities.
What is DEXA?
DEXA is a bone density scan. For surveys, generally that's a lead into an online survey. You just list the elements of consent, and their movement to the survey is their consent to participate. They can quit at any time though still. The vulnerable populations at ASU and under the regulations are pregnant women, but not for survey research. Like a pregnant woman can take a survey just like anybody else can. Prisoners are always, studies involving prisoners are always reviewed by the full board. Children under the age of 18 studies, unless it's in the classroom setting, and we exempt those as normal educational or special educational outreach. Other vulnerable populations are children with disabilities or adults who are not competent to consent. So decisionally impaired, undocumented immigrants, very poor, people from a foreign country where their opportunities are monitored, activities that are illegal behaviors. At ASU, any participation by Native Americans who reside on tribal property require a cultural review, and those studies generally go to the full board. We've talked about that. The applications are pretty standard: who, what, when, where, why, and how. How many people, what are they going to do? Expedited doesn't mean faster, but we usually get them done in about a week to 10 days. There is, there's a little bit of worry about the definitions and how they fit, so we don't expect the investigators to be the specialists on where their studies fall, although many of you have been doing human subjects for years, so you'll know if it's exempt or not, and you'll know how to describe that. So coded private information is information that you're getting from a colleague or from a data bank. that has no links or keys to identifiers, and those do not require human subjects approval. Full board is always research that's more than minimal risk. It doesn't fit within the categories for either expedited or exempt research. The committee has 3 activities they can do. They can approve with modifications, which requires you to make some minor changes, or they can disapprove. Investigators are not required to come to the IRB meetings, but if you're disapproved a second time, we invite you to come discuss the challenges. It's very rare that someone is even disapproved at the first level, because we have staff review and then we have a primary reviewer that may call you with any questions. So, but by the time it gets to the board, it's pretty clean. All of the application processes are exactly the same. We have 2 applications, social behavioral and bioscience. The application site is open 24/7. The board meets once a month, and the deadline is 12 days before the meeting, so that we can get it cleaned up a little bit. You'll get a confirmation when your application is received, and you'll get staff comments within 3 days. Make sure when you submit your applications that you submit all the supporting documentation, so your consent form, all of your instruments. Just submit everything in English. If you are going to have to translate a document, we ask that you wait to have that translated until after you get your close to approval, so that we're not sending you out to get translations done numerous times. We do not have a required site that you have to go get your material done at. You can use any person who is competent in the language to perform your consent in the language, and then someone separate from that needs to do a back translation for you, not you. We do have a contract with the Western IRB. They provide, they're more clinical in nature, so the few clinical trials that we do have with our hospital partners, we run through WERB. If the PI chooses to go through WERB on their own and our IRB could have been competent to review it, we ask that they pay the fee. If the university defers to them, we pay the fee. We can make some kind of arrangement. Sometimes you have a grant coming in or a project where the first part of the timeline is not your human subjects activities, but you need to get people on board and get your hiring process done and develop your materials. So we call that a 118 approval. So if you ever have a time when you don't have all your material ready to go to launch your human subjects activities, just call and talk to one of IRB coordinators and they can help you maneuver that. We do have affiliation agreements with the University of Arizona and Maricopa Integration Health Services, Mayo, and PCH, so that we don't require duplicate proposals. We have a local contextual review, so we try to streamline that. We're always happy to consider affiliations with other universities so that we can streamline the process for you and your colleagues, such as Oklahoma State or University of California. Most institutions are willing to collaborate. Ways to make the process smooth is submit your materials in English only, answer all the questions on applications, write your applications so that someone who is unfamiliar with your field can understand what you're doing. And when you get questions from the IRB asking about your methodology, reply promptly so they can get back to you quickly. The IRB has methods for evaluating protocols, making sure there's no risks or that they're minimized. They evaluate the risk and risk-benefit to the risk and benefit ratio. They want to see equitable selection of subjects, a very adequate informed consent process, that you have taken good care of the privacy and confidentiality of your records, and that you have implemented any necessary safeguards for vulnerable populations. These are the ways you can minimize risk. I've already talked about principal investigators. Responsibilities. So study approvals are good for a year unless you're exempt, and then they're good indefinitely. A study is complete only when the data collection and analysis are complete. And currently you have to submit a continuing review form if you come up on your annual review and you need to continue. When you make changes to your protocol, if you're not exempt, in cases where your study is not determined to be exempt, you have to send in submission of modifications. If you're changing your study design, if you have any changes to any of your instruments, if you want to change your consent document or the process, if you want to add or delete investigators, if you want to change the project title, or if you want to change the research sites. This is our contact information, and I have lots of time for questions. Oh, microphone. Luckily, I have this little thing, so I don't have to.
So I have another question that's similar to the question that was asked before. I was working on a project at a previous university. There's still an active IRB for that project at another university. Do I have to submit something at ASU to continue to work with the data, or is the active IRB for the projects at another university sufficient?
I think we probably should do an affiliation agreement with them.
Okay.
Leave you on the protocol and have them cover it. So if you'll send me an email, I'll have Susan send you the directions.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have two questions. For research done in most of the schools around here, the K-12 classrooms, are the consents done in multiple languages for the parents? Is that a yes?
No, it was a cough. Repeat the question. I've got allergies today. So you want to know about the consent process for schools in general? So we ask that you submit them all in English to us. If you think that there's going to be, it is not uncommon to see them come in and ask for translation into Spanish. We haven't seen requests for translations in many other languages. Sometimes they exclude parents who can't either consent in English or Spanish, or they ask for a verbal consent process where they can sit and talk to the parent and see if there's a way that they can make sure that it's a voluntary consent. Did that answer your question?
Thank you.
You had two?
Yeah, the other one was just about, you answered the question about video data collection in the classroom when it was focused primarily on the teacher, but what if you're also not interested in just the teacher, but you're also interested in collecting it?
So we do see those applications. You would not get an exempt determination on that. You would have to have a video release from the school, from the parents, and from the child. And probably they would ask that you not use those, that you use that data collected from video for research purposes only, not to display, not to, again, display the photos of the child unless you mask them.
Thank you.
Hi.
So I was curious as far as responsibility goes. I understand that would be the investigator that would be responsible for obtaining an IRB, so they would identify that IRB process needs to take place, correct?
Correct.
If there is an incident, then the person that is then, the person that would, what's the right words I want to say? Does that come down then on just the investigator, or is the college also that the investigator's part of it? Do they also take part in that responsibility?
So we don't require that the unit sign off on the protocols. So the investigator is authorized to submit a protocol independently. So if you have student investigators or graduate students, postdocs, or whoever's working with you on it, mistakes will happen. Like laptops can get lost, records can get lost, breaches of confidentiality can happen. So while we hope it's rare, the most important thing is to make sure that you come forward quickly so that we can correct to make a correction and an announcement if we need to, and that you be responsible for any remedial training of your students. There's not like a big hammer. Unless it was like intentional. So we had one faculty member long ago who was supervising a thesis project for a student, and the student was collecting data from juveniles in prisons without approval. And he knew better. It wasn't pretty.
So then,
But other than doing something illegal, it's just a remedial correction process.
but again, then the college though is not does not have to worry about any repercussions that come from that. That was
Well, we all have to worry about that, right? If it's a media blitz or if someone's hurt. So we institutionally, we would all be responsible still.
that answers my question. Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions?
So I haven't really, I'm not too prepared with my research yet. It's something I'm planning to do in the future in a year or two. But one of the research that I am interested in is going to Brazil to a specific school system to study their K through 12 system. And because it's international and if mostly it will be interviews, but I'm hoping to interview some of the students as well. Is there any difference when I would be interviewing students from in a different country?
So I am not familiar with human subjects protection requirements in Brazil, but when your application comes in, we'll look those up.
Okay.
So we'll need to make sure that whatever government approvals are required, we help you get, that we help you understand what they are to get. And then with same kind of approval, school approval, teacher approval, parent approval, and make sure that everybody's on board with your plan. It's not uncommon. So.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
I know that the consent is implied when they click to proceed with the survey. So for a study with college students, if you are identifying the group of students based on either a remediation course or some type of program improvement plan, for example, because that group of students is there's a reason you're looking within that group, would that be exempt or would that be?
It probably would be expedited, and it would need to be not by the instructors of the students.
Right.
So it would need to be done by a person removed from the research, from the classroom, and it would need to be all after the fact, and there would need to demonstrate some kind of, it's always nice if you're working with students and they're students in need, that you give them something back, not monetary.
Right, but the benefit
an
is
educational
explicit.
benefit to them.
Yeah, or like program improvement or
Right,
something.
right.
Okay, thank you.
I didn't talk, and I don't know what happened to the slide, I didn't talk about classroom research. So at ASU, we do not expect that research done in the classroom, where you're teaching your students research methods, requires IRB approval. Because we believe it's not going to be generalized outside the classroom. But and we have a handout sheet on the IRB website that talks about it. We do expect that you'll be responsible for still, regardless of the need of IRB approval or not, there's a responsibility for informed consent if they're surveying. Other questions?
So my question is a little bit more on the technical side of like survey collected data, for example. Are there sort of standard guidelines as to how long the investigator needs to retain the digital copy of the survey instrument?
So the data retention records for the university say 3 years after the close of the project. If I were you and I thought I would ever use the data, again, I would make sure I had it very well transcribed. But 3 years after you've transcribed it and you have the records, there's not a need to have the consents or the records of the survey documents.
So follow up on the survey question. I think the question may have been, well, my translation of that question is, how long does it need to stay in Qualtrics versus how long do I have to keep like a PDF download of the survey or an Excel download of the data? Do I need to keep it in or SurveyMonkey? Do I need to keep that?
Not after you transcribe it, I don't think you need to keep it. If you haven't gotten good data transfer practices, keep it till you have it. No, until you have it all transcribed. The only thing that might impact that is the use of others to replicate your results. So if you don't think that the data that you transcribed and recorded would be sufficient for someone to replicate your work, you might want to keep it a little longer. But that's subjective based on your discipline. Survey research, I mean, usually you probably wouldn't need it to have someone replicate it. They should be able to replicate it from your transcription. Anything else? Well, for those of you that are new to ASU and have come from other places with the IRB, I hope you have had good experiences in the past, but I will tell you that our IRB staff are just terrific, and they really are here to help. And so if you ever have trouble and you just can't communicate with them because they're just not getting it, give me a call, because I just think it will probably be a miscommunication. We mostly communicate with investigators these days through the system, so we ask our questions there, and it's just like email. In an email, it's the friendliness and the support doesn't always come through. So if you ever get stuck, give me a call. Well, I'll help you make it right.
Thank you. Any
Anything
other
else?
last questions? Good. Okay.
Thank you for your time. It's the best of what we do.